The smell of roasted coffee and garlic butter filled the small restaurant, and Emma moved quickly between the tables with a practiced smile, balancing 2 plates in one hand and a tray of glasses in the other. She had been working here for almost 2 years. Ever since her father passed away and her mother's health began to fade, every night was the same. Tired feet, fake smiles, and tips that barely covered her bills. But she never complained. She always believed that hard work meant hope, and hope was all she had left. Her black apron was stained from long shifts and her hair was tied back tightly. A small strand kept falling across her cheek, and she kept brushing it away while taking orders. "Yes, sir. Right away," she said with that soft tone she practiced in the mirror years ago. The customers rarely noticed her kindness, but she never let it change her. To them, she was just another waitress, a background figure who delivered food and disappeared quietly. But deep inside, Emma was not ordinary. She once dreamed of standing on a stage, her fingers dancing over piano keys, the crowd lost in her music. Her father used to call her his little melody, and when he died, the music inside her died too. The old piano they had at home sat untouched now, covered in dust every time she passed by it. Her heart ached. She would trace her fingers on its wooden edge, whispering, "Maybe someday," but that someday never came. That evening was unusually busy. The restaurant buzzed with chatter and laughter, couples celebrating anniversaries, businessmen discussing deals. Emma's shoes squeaked on the polished floor as she hurried from one end to the other, carrying heavy trays and polite smiles. The lights were soft and golden, bouncing off the grand piano that sat silently in the corner. No one ever played it anymore. It was just decoration now, forgotten like her dream. She caught herself glancing at it as she passed, remembering the feel of ivory keys beneath her fingertips, her father's voice saying, "Play from your heart, not your hands." She blinked quickly and turned away, shaking her head, reminding herself she was at work. Not in a memory, her coworker, Jake, noticed her staring. "You thinking of quitting?" he teased as he passed by carrying drinks. She smiled faintly. "No, just thinking." He grinned. "Well, don't think too much, it doesn't pay the bills." She laughed softly, but his words hit deep. The restaurant's door chimed. A man walked in, tall, wearing a simple gray suit. Not flashy like the usual rich crowd, but there was something about the way he carried himself. Calm, confident like he owned the air around him. Emma greeted him with her usual warmth. "Good evening, sir, table for one." He nodded and followed her to a seat near the piano. As she handed him the menu, he looked around slowly, taking in the place, his eyes thoughtful. "It's a nice restaurant," he said, "but it's missing something." Emma smiled politely. "Missing something, sir?" He pointed at the piano. "That. It should be played." She hesitated, her heart skipping a beat. "It hasn't been used in a while," she replied softly. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. "Do you play?" For a second, Emma forgot how to breathe. No one had asked her that in years. She forced a small laugh. "Not anymore, sir. I'm just the waitress." The man smiled faintly as if he saw through her words. "There's no such thing as just when it comes to art," he said quietly, then went back to studying the menu. Emma turned away quickly, pretending to check her notepad, but her hands trembled. She tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting to that piano, to her father, to the songs she had locked away. The restaurant noise faded for a moment, replaced by the echo of melodies that once filled her small home. Later that night, as she cleared a table nearby, she noticed the man still sitting there sipping his coffee slowly. Watching the piano again, she wondered who he was, why he cared so much about something everyone else had forgotten. The clock struck 10, her shift almost over. Emma wiped her hands on her apron and glanced once more at the piano. The dim light reflected off its polished surface like a silent invitation. She didn't know that within the next hour that same piano would change her life. For now she sighed, smiled at another customer, and whispered under her breath, "Just one more night, Emma. You can do this." She had no idea that the stranger watching her had a plan, and that her ordinary shift was about to become the most extraordinary night of her life. The man in the gray suit sat quietly, stirring his coffee while his eyes followed Emma as she moved between tables. There was something in the way she carried herself. Calm, careful, like a person who had learned to hide her pain behind politeness. Every time she walked past the grand piano, her gaze lingered on it for just a heartbeat too long, and he noticed most people ignored that piano, but not her. and he could tell she once belonged to its sound. He smiled slightly, a knowing look flickering in his eyes. He had seen that look before. The look of someone who loved music but was too afraid to touch it again. As the night grew quieter, the chatter in the restaurant softened, and the candles burned low. Emma brought the man his bill. "I hope everything was to your liking, sir," she said gently. The man nodded but didn't take the receipt. "Tell me," he asked, "do you still play?" Emma froze, her hands tightening on the tray. "Play what, sir?" she asked, pretending not to understand. His eyes met hers, sharp but kind. "The piano," he said simply. For a moment she didn't speak. The memory of her father teaching her the notes flooded back. The sound of laughter, the warmth of home, and the echo of promises that never came true. "No," she whispered finally. "Not anymore." The man leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "Why not?" he asked. She smiled sadly. "Because life got expensive." Her voice cracked a little, but she covered it with a polite grin. He nodded, setting his cup down slowly. "You know," he said, "there are two kinds of people who stop playing. The ones who quit, and the ones who wait for a reason to start again." His words hit something deep inside her. She laughed softly to push away the ache. "And which one do you think I am, sir?" she asked. He tilted his head. "That's what I'm trying to find out," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, he looked at the piano again. "Play for me." Emma blinked, confused. Sorry, what?" He smiled. "One song, that's all." The nearby tables turned their heads, whispers spreading quickly. "Is he serious?" One man whispered, "She's a waitress, not an entertainer." Another laughed. The manager looked up from the counter, unsure what to say, but curiosity flickered across his face. Emma shook her head nervously. "Sir, I haven't played in years." The man's voice softened. "You can. You just forgot you could." The other guests were now watching openly, some amused, some expectant. The room's attention made her feel like a cornered bird. Her heart raced, her cheeks burned, and she could barely breathe. The man reached into his coat pocket and placed a small folded check on the table. "If you can move me," he said. "This is yours." Emma stared at the paper, not believing him. "I don't need your money," she said quickly. "Good," he replied calmly. "Then do it for yourself." Her manager stepped closer, half smiling. "Go ahead, Emma, give the man what he wants." "It's good for business," the crowd chuckled, expecting a clumsy tune. Emma looked at the piano like it was an old friend she had betrayed. Her hands trembled, and for a moment she wanted to run to the back room and hide. But something inside her whispered, "Play." Her father's voice, maybe, or her own heart remembering who she once was. She took a deep breath, set down her tray, and walked toward the piano. Her shoes clicked softly against the floor. The restaurant fell silent, the kind of silence that felt alive, like the air itself was waiting when she reached the piano. She touched its surface with shaking fingers. Dust rose slightly, and she felt tears in her eyes. She sat slowly on the bench, her reflection faintly visible in the polished wood. The keys looked both familiar and foreign, like a language she had forgotten. Behind her, someone whispered, "She's actually going to do it." Another voice chuckled. This should be funny. But the man in the gray suit didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on her, serious and patient. Emma placed her fingers on the keys and pressed one. A soft note filled the room, delicate and trembling, but beautiful. The sound wrapped around her like warmth in winter. She closed her eyes, her heart pounding. And for the first time in years, she didn't think about bills or pain or what people thought. She thought about her father, the man who told her music could heal the soul. She could almost hear him whisper, "Play from your heart. My little melody." Emma took a shaky breath, her fingers poised again, and though her voice was barely a whisper, she said, "All right, one last time." Then she began to play, and the first real note of her rebirth echoed through the restaurant, making even the laughter fade into stunned silence. ChatGPT said, the first few notes slipped out of the piano like whispers from another world. Soft and uncertain, Emma's fingers trembled, her heart thudding so loudly she could almost hear it in her ears. The restaurant, once filled with chatter and clinking glasses, fell completely silent. Even the waiters stopped moving, standing still with trays in their hands. The man in the gray suit leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving her. The light above the piano shimmered softly on the polished wood, and for a moment the whole room felt suspended in time. Emma's hands shook as she pressed, Another key, then another. The melody began to grow, faint at first, but then stronger, braver. But halfway through the piece, her nerves caught up to her. She hit the wrong note, her rhythm faltered, and the room seemed to exhale. Someone in the back giggled quietly. Another voice whispered, "I knew it, she can't play." The sound stung like a blade. Her breath caught and her hands froze. The man in the gray suit didn't move, he didn't sigh or smirk or speak. He simply looked at her, his eyes calm and unshaken. It was the kind of look that didn't demand perfection, only honesty, and somehow that made her heart steady again. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and remembered the voice of her father, warm and patient. "Play from your heart, not from your head," he used to say. Slowly, her fingers began to move again. The wrong note no longer mattered. The music started to flow. Raw, emotional, imperfect, but alive this time. The notes weren't just sounds, they were memories. Each key told a story. The bright one spoke of laughter in her small living room, as her father clapped for her tiny hands on the piano. The soft ones whispered of long nights spent listening to the rain when she missed him. The deep ones carried the pain of losing him, and the strength of surviving without him. The people watching began to change. The giggles faded, the smirks softened, and even the servers seemed lost in the tune. The melody spread through the air, filling every corner of the restaurant with something they couldn't describe. Some customers leaned closer, others closed their eyes. Then something beautiful happened. The light seemed to dim around her, as if the room itself wanted to listen. Her hands moved faster now. Her fingers confident and alive, the sound swelled, tender and wild, a song of love, loss, and rediscovery. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't stop. She played as if the piano was speaking for her soul. The man in the gray suit closed his eyes for a moment, his expression changing. There was something familiar in that melody, a distant echo of his own past. He felt his chest tighten, a lump forming in his throat. The song, her song, reminded him of someone he had lost long ago, someone who had once played the same tune. By now, the entire restaurant was spellbound. Forks lay untouched, conversations forgotten. Even the kitchen staff peeked out through the door, listening. No one expected the waitress, the quiet girl who took orders and smiled politely, to hold such power in her hands. Emma leaned into the final part of the song, her body swaying slightly with each note. Her hair had come loose, strands falling over her face, but she didn't care. She was no longer playing for them or even for the man who had challenged her. She was playing for herself, for her father, for every dream she had locked away, and then silence. The last note lingered in the air like the last breath of a dream. Her hand stayed frozen above the keys. Trembling, afraid to move, the room was utterly still. Not a whisper, not a sound. Then someone gasped, soft but audible. Another person exhaled shakily. Then came a single clap, slow, deliberate. It came from the man in the gray suit. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were wet. He clapped again, and soon the entire restaurant followed. Applause filled the room like thunder. Loud and endless, Emma turned around slowly, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't speak, couldn't even smile. She simply bowed her head, overcome by emotion. The man stood up and walked toward her. His footsteps echoed softly across the floor. When he reached her, he didn't say anything right away. He just looked at her with a strange mix of awe and sadness. Finally, in a quiet voice that only she could hear, he said, "That song, my mother used to play it." Emma stared at him, confused. "Your mother?" she whispered. He nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "She taught me that same melody when I was a boy." His voice cracked slightly. "You played it the exact same way she did, with pain and love together." Emma's breath hitched. The song she thought belonged only to her father had somehow found its way into another heart. The man smiled faintly through his tears. "You didn't just play music tonight," he said softly. "You brought a memory back to life." And as he turned toward the stunned audience, one thought echoed in every mind. They hadn't just witnessed a performance. They had witnessed a miracle. For a long moment after the applause faded, the restaurant stayed in that strange silence, the kind that follows after something sacred. Emma sat there at the piano, her hands still trembling, her heart racing like a drum. The man in the gray suit had walked closer, his shadow falling softly across the keys. He was quiet, but his eyes told her everything. They were not the eyes of a critic or a customer. They were the eyes of someone who had just been changed. He smiled slowly. "You said you weren't good anymore," he said softly. Emma wiped at her tears. Embarrassed, "I'm not, sir, I don't know what happened." Her voice cracked as she tried to speak. The man tilted his head slightly. "What happened is honesty," he said. "You played truth. Not notes." The crowd around them was still whispering. People murmuring words like beautiful, unbelievable, and who is she? The manager, who moments ago only wanted a bit of entertainment for the guests, now stood near the bar looking stunned. He had never seen his restaurant that silent before. Not even on its best nights, Emma stood slowly from the bench. Unsure what to do next, she wanted to disappear, to escape the attention, but before she could take a step, the man said, "Wait." His voice was calm, but there was something in it, authority. "Wait." She turned to him nervously. He took a folded envelope from his jacket and placed it gently on the piano. "That's not payment," he said. "It's gratitude." Emma looked at the envelope and then back at him. "Sir, I can't take that," she said quickly. But he smiled. "Then don't think of it as money. Think of it as faith in you." She didn't understand, but something about his tone made her stop arguing. He stepped back and looked around the room. "You've all witnessed something real tonight," he said to the guests. "In a world full of noise, this young woman reminded us what silence feels like." The words sent shivers down Emma's spine. People began to clap again, not just for her music, but for the courage it took to play it. When the applause ended, the man turned to leave. But Emma, still confused, called out softly, "Sir, wait, who are you?" He paused, his hand on the door. "Just someone who never stopped listening," he said quietly. And then he walked out into the night, leaving her speechless. After he left, the restaurant felt different, warmer somehow. The guests returned to their meals, but the air carried a strange energy. People smiled at Emma. Some nodded politely. Others whispered her name, "That waitress. She's amazing," one woman said. You could feel her heart in the music. Emma returned to the counter, still dazed. Jake, her co-worker, stared at her with wide eyes. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. "I don't know," she said, almost laughing. "I just played." He leaned closer. "Played?" Emma, people were crying. "The guy at table 5 tipped me 100 just because he said he witnessed history." She shook her head in disbelief. It was just one song. The manager came over, holding the envelope the man had left. "He said to give this to you," he said, handing it over. "Are you sure?" She asked. "Maybe it was for the restaurant." The manager chuckled. "If it was, he'd have written our name, not yours." She opened it carefully, and her breath caught. Inside was a check, but not for a small amount. It was enough to pay her mother's hospital bills. Maybe more. Her eyes filled again with tears. But this time they were tears of shock. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He can't be serious." Jake leaned over and looked, his jaw dropping. "Emma, that guy wasn't just some customer. Who gives that kind of money just for a song?" He said, "Maybe he's crazy." She laughed weakly, wiping her eyes. "Or maybe," Jake said softly, "he saw something the rest of us missed." That night, after the restaurant closed, Emma sat alone at the piano, running her fingers gently over the keys. The room was dark now, empty except for the faint glow from the streetlights outside. She pressed one key softly, a single note echoing through the silence. It sounded different now, fuller, warmer, alive. She smiled faintly, whispering to the air, "Dad, I played again." Her reflection shimmered faintly on the piano lid, like her father was smiling back when she turned to leave. She found the man's business card slipped beneath the check. She hadn't seen it before. It had a logo she didn't recognize and a name printed in silver letters. Julian Carter, founder, Silvernote Studios. Her breath caught. She had heard of that name. Everyone who loved music had. It was one of the biggest recording companies in the city. Emma stared at the card, her fingers trembling again. The man wasn't just a kind stranger. He was someone who could change her life. She looked once more at the piano and then at the card, feeling a mix of fear and hope rising inside her. The choice in front of her was clear. She could walk away, or she could follow the sound that had never truly left her heart. And as she tucked the card carefully into her apron, she smiled to herself and whispered, "Maybe someday starts tomorrow." Then she turned off the lights and stepped out into the cool night, unaware that the most beautiful chapter of her life had just begun. The next morning, the sun rose through a hazy sky, painting the small city in gold. Emma stood in front of the giant glass building with shaking hands, the silver lit. But one thing was clear. Her life was no longer a quiet melody in the background. It was a song the whole world had begun to hum. And as dawn touched her window, she whispered, "Whatever tomorrow is, I'll play it with my heart," not knowing that tomorrow, her name would be spoken on every screen, every radio, every stage that once felt impossible to reach. The morning sunlight spilled across Emma's small apartment, painting the walls in soft gold. She barely touched her breakfast, her hands trembling as she checked the time again and again. Her heart raced. Julian's message from last night still echoed in her head. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., bring your courage. Big day. She didn't know what that meant. But something deep inside told her that her life was about to change again. When she arrived at Silvernote Studios, the air felt different, busier, louder. There were camera crews outside, people with microphones, flashes from photographers. Her stomach twisted. "What's going on?" she whispered. As she stepped through the glass doors, the receptionist smiled. "Congratulations, Miss Emma," she said warmly. Emma blinked. "For what?" The woman grinned. "You'll see." Julian was waiting for her in the lobby, dressed sharply but smiling like a proud mentor. "You ready?" he asked. "For what?" She laughed nervously. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "For your introduction to the world." Before she could ask anything, he led her down a hallway to a large recording hall she had never entered before. The door opened and she froze. There were cameras, lights, and at least 30 people inside, including reporters, musicians, and a few faces she recognized from music magazines. On the stage stood a sleek black piano with a silver plaque that read, "For Emma." What is this?" she stammered. Julian smiled. "The launch," he said softly. "Your debut as an artist," her heart pounded. "I'm not ready," she whispered. "I don't even have an album." He chuckled. "You don't need one, you have a story. And that's stronger than any record." As they stepped onto the stage, one of the reporters raised a camera. "Miss Emma, the world fell in love with your piano video. How does it feel to go viral overnight?" She didn't know what to say. The lights felt too bright, the noise too loud. Julian leaned toward her and whispered, "Breathe. Just tell them the truth." She looked out at the crowd, her voice shaking at first. I didn't expect any of this," she began softly. "I just played because I missed my dad." The room quieted. The camera's still flashing, but slower now. "I was a waitress a week ago," she said, "and I never thought anyone would listen to me again. But that night, I realized something. Sometimes all it takes is one song to remind people they still have hearts." There was a hush, then soft applause. Julian smiled proudly beside her. The reporters asked more questions about her past, about the mysterious man who had challenged her, about her new record deal. She answered each one in her simple, honest way. "I didn't chase this," she said at one point. "It found me when I finally stopped running from who I was." After the conference, Julian asked her to stay. "There's one more surprise," he said. She looked at him suspiciously. "You've had enough surprises for one lifetime." He laughed. "Trust me, you'll like this one." He led her back into the studio, where the lights had dimmed and a small audience was waiting. Friends from the restaurant, studio staff, even Jake, who waved from the back with a grin. Julian whispered, "Play your song again, this time. For everyone who believed when you didn't." Emma nodded. Taking a deep breath, she sat at the new piano, her fingers resting gently on the keys, and for a few seconds, she just listened to the heartbeat in her chest, the faint hum of the lights, the quiet expectation in the air. Then she began to play. The sound was different this time, confident, radiant, full of joy instead of sorrow. Her hands flowed across the keys like they belonged there. The melody was the same, but the emotion had evolved. It was no longer about pain or loss, it was about growth, hope, and the courage to begin again. As she played, she caught sight of Jake wiping his eyes, of the cooks from the restaurant smiling proudly, of Julian standing with his arms folded, his face glowing with quiet satisfaction. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she imagined her father standing too, watching, smiling, whispering, "Play from your heart, my little melody." When the last note faded, the room exploded in applause, louder than before, louder than she'd ever heard. People stood up, cheering. Some even shouted her name, "Emma, Emma." She laughed through her tears. Overwhelmed, Julian walked onto the stage, placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "You did it." but then he raised his voice for everyone to hear. "You all know her as the waitress who played the piano," he said. "But from today, the world will know her as Emma Lane, the artist who reminded us that music still has a soul." The crowd cheered again, her name echoing through the hall like a promise. Emma stood there, breathless, her heart full. It was the same heart that once believed she was invisible, now beating under the brightest lights of her life. That night, as she left the studio, she looked up at the city sky, stars twinkling faintly above the glowing streets. She whispered to herself, "This isn't the end. It's the first note of something new." And somewhere deep within the city, people were already humming her song, the waitress's waltz that became the sound of a miracle. The night of her debut never truly ended. It simply melted into a new dawn that belonged to her. By morning, the news had spread everywhere. "Emma Lane, the waitress who moved the world," read one headline. Another said, "From trays to triumph, the piano that silenced a city." Her face was on screens, her voice on the radio, and her melody echoing from car windows across the streets she used to walk home on. Emma sat on her small balcony with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Watching the rising sun touch the rooftops, she was exhausted. But it was a beautiful kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes when dreams finally stop chasing you and start walking beside you. Her phone buzzed constantly, hundreds of messages from strangers, friends, reporters, and musicians. But one message stood out, from Julian. "Check the news. You did it." She turned on the TV and nearly dropped the remote. A news anchor was smiling as the headline scrolled beneath. "Emma Lane signs exclusive deal with Silver Note Records. Debut album in progress." Her chest tightened. She hadn't even processed it all yet. Her life had changed faster than she could breathe. The doorbell rang. She opened it to find Jake standing there holding flowers. "You're impossible, you know that?" He laughed. "I can't even tell people I work with you anymore, and they think I'm making it up." Emma smiled, her eyes watering. "You shouldn't have." "Please," he said, handing her the flowers. "You bought my mom a new oven with your tip money last month. You deserve the world." They sat together, laughing like old times, but when the laughter faded, Jake asked softly, "Are you happy?" She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "I think so," she whispered. "It's strange, though. It doesn't feel like I became someone new. It feels like I finally came home." Later that afternoon, Emma arrived at the studio. Julian was there waiting, surrounded by a team of producers and camera crews. "We're starting the album today," he said, handing her a notebook inside. She found her father's name written in gold, for Thomas Lane. Her throat tightened. "You remembered," she said. He smiled. "How could I forget? He's in every note you play." They spent hours recording, rewriting, laughing, and creating. The studio that once felt intimidating now felt like a second home. Between sessions, Julian told her stories about his mother, the one who used to play the same song Emma had played that first night. "She taught me that music doesn't come from talent," he said. "It comes from pain that learned how to sing." Emma nodded softly. "Then we're both singing for the people we lost." Weeks turned into months. The album came together, each song a chapter of her journey, from the quiet grief of the restaurant nights to the triumphant melody of rediscovery. The final track was a duet, Julian on piano, Emma singing for the first time. Her voice, fragile yet powerful, carried the same emotion that had once stunned a room full of strangers. When the album released, it didn't just top charts, and it changed people. Fans wrote letters saying her songs helped them find courage again. Parents played it for their children. Hospitals used it in therapy rooms. The world had found healing in the sound of a waitress's heart. But for Emma, the most unforgettable moment came months later. When she returned to the same restaurant where it all began, it had changed too. Brighter lights, new decor, and a framed photo of her by the piano. The manager smiled proudly when she walked in. "You made this place famous, Emma," he said. She laughed. "No, the piano did," that night after closing hours. She sat at that same piano once more. The lights dimmed and she played softly, quietly, not for an audience, not for a record, just for herself. The melody drifted through the empty room, gentle as a heartbeat, and for a moment, she felt her father there, warm, proud, and listening. A voice behind her broke the silence. "You still make the room stop." She turned to see Julian standing in the doorway, smiling. She chuckled. "Old habits, don't stop them," he said, walking closer. "The world still needs your kind of quiet." Emma looked around the empty restaurant. The place that had once been her cage and now was her beginning, she whispered. Funny, isn't it? How one night can change everything. Julian nodded. It didn't just change everything. It reminded us that sometimes the smallest moments hold the loudest echoes. She smiled, her fingers resting on the piano keys again. Then I guess I'll keep playing, she said. Outside, the city buzzed with life, but inside there was only her, the piano, and the melody that had carried her from silence to song. And as the final note faded into the night, one truth remained. Dreams don't die. They just wait for the right moment to be heard.